Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, and welcome to New Books in Genocide Studies, part of the New Books Network of podcasts. My name is Kelly McFall from Newman University, and I'm a host on the show. And today I'm thrilled to welcome back Rachel O'Sullivan, author of the terrific new book, Nazi Germany, Annexed Poland, and Colonial Rule, Resettlement, Germanization, and Population Policies in Comparative Perspective, published by Bloomsbury Academic. Rachel, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us again on New Books in Genocide Studies.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
So the last time you were on, we were joined by Michelle Gordon for the volume you two co-edited in the European Holocaust Studies series. That one was called Colonial Paradigms of Violence. This time we're going to talk about the book that you authored singly, the book of Nazi Germany, Annexed Poland, and Colonial Rule. So maybe I'll just ask you to start by saying a little bit about where this book came from. What drew you to the topic? What made you decide you wanted to spend what I'm guessing is years of your life writing about this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I guess I came to this topic initially during my master's. My master's supervisor was Stefan Malinowski, and then he also was later my PhD supervisor. And Stefan Malinowski was essentially involved in the sort of early 2000s in this debate about the potentiality for a continuity between German colonialism, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust. And so he sort of introduced me to this topic actually during a master's seminar on different sort of trends and different debates within Holocaust studies. And so yeah, this book sort of starts at my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis more so looked at colonial discourses. And within these sort of colonial discourses, they were ones that were sort of shared between Germany's sort of need, desire, fantasies towards expanding overseas and towards expanding into Eastern Europe. And so I looked at the sort of crossovers between the two, and that actually sort of forms the fifth chapter in the book. And in 2019, I started as a postdoc at the Center for Holocaust Studies, and that's where my sort of interest in the sort of Holocaust angle came into it. And I looked more so at these kind of population policies.
So let's start on the book, just from a very kind of general level. If you look at this from 30,000 feet, what's the thesis of the book?
So the book is set in the two Reichsgaue or Reich districts. So they're the two areas of Poland that are annexed to Nazi Germany in 1939. One is the Reichsgaue Wartheland, and the other is the Reichsgaue Danzig West Prussia. And so I examine inclusionary population policies such as Germanization, which is this sort of assimilation process, also settlement, alongside exclusionary population policies through a colonial perspective. And so that basically means that I've taken different theories, different literature, different examples from colonial history to analyze alongside these policies. And so in doing so, the book kind of shows where different parts of the Nazi expansionary project, so this idea to move towards the East, which of course includes the Holocaust within it, aligns with colonial patterns, not only in terms of these sort of fantasies of occupying the space, but also in the reality of what's happening day-to-day society, how the people are experiencing their sort of tasks and their everyday life there. And so ultimately the book argues that by setting the Holocaust into this framework, we can highlight how interconnected, seemingly contradictory Nazi population policies were. And I sort of argue that it's actually this interconnectedness that is a definite point of similarity with colonial projects.
So we're going to take that answer or that thesis apart and look at each part of it as we go through the interview and talk about the book. But just to lay out some background for those of the listeners who are not familiar with this discussion about colonialism and mass violence, can you talk a little bit about how historians of mass violence have looked at colonialism and tried to understand the connections or lack of connections, or the way those may have entangled or rhymed or whatever the right word is, just as a way of setting up the book?
Yeah, so this is something that Michelle Gordon, who I co-edited the Colonial Paradigms of Violence with, is probably a great expert on. So I'm sort of coming to this more so, I guess, from this Holocaust side of things. But essentially, for a long time, certainly within the field of, for example, colonial history, there has been perhaps an unwillingness, whether that's conscious or unconsciously, to perhaps address certain parts of colonial violence through the lens of genocide, essentially. This sometimes partially goes back to the idea that the Holocaust is this sort of benchmark of genocide. So the term that we have, genocide, it gets written into law after the Holocaust. And so there's often this sort of almost assumption that the Holocaust is this first genocide, or the sort of, the sort of top of the spectrum. And that's kind of filtered down into our public memory of the Holocaust and other genocides, but also academic research. And there has been sometimes this unwillingness to put colonial violence or also types of mass violence into a genocide category, and therefore also kind of comparing it to the Holocaust. But in recent years, we've seen more of an interaction actually between the different academic disciplines. I mean, it has been slow, but we're getting there. And that's historians of events of mass violence or of events of colonial violence and the Holocaust coming together and actually trying to see what parts of each specific circumstance perhaps aligns with each other. Where can we identify patterns in things like state violence, but also in more sort of situations of isolated or individualized violence. And by identifying these patterns, I guess, to an extent, what new questions that we can ask too, because in a way, it's all about bringing in the new perspectives to ask new questions and then to hopefully find the new answers.
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent summary. Genocide studies tends to have a very presentist approach, that the purpose of genocide studies is to prevent similar kind of mass violence in the future. Your answer was not parallel. It kind of intersected with that, but it was different, right? And so I'm intrigued from a Holocaust studies perspective. The way you responded was that this new focus, this new lens allows us to ask new questions. What kind of new questions?
What kind of new questions? Yeah. I mean, I guess to an extent, sometimes as a historian, you kind of have to feel like you have to prove the value of your work in current day situations. So maybe I'll link it to that a little bit. Germany at the moment is becoming increasingly diverse and increasingly multicultural. It's always been praised for this sort of strong Holocaust memory and Holocaust education. But at the same time, what we see is the rise of anti-Semitism, rise of the far right, also rise in Islamophobia. So we do have to start, once again, asking ourselves questions about how successful the use of the Holocaust is sort of in the sort of public memory, in education. And so I think in one way, actually, sort of intersecting between disciplines is something that will become increasingly relevant in the future, because it is essentially bringing in perspectives and voices that might not necessarily have always been heard up to now. And I think in a way that sort of by diversifying actually the research, you're getting more diverse population groups involved. And hopefully that will in some way filter down to how we remember not only the Holocaust, but also colonialism, other instances of mass violence, and following on from that, what we can learn for present day society.
As a historian, I don't actually feel too much of a need to justify our existence, although my dean and provost might disagree with me. But thank you. So why set the book in the Vaterland and Danzig, West Prussia?
That's a great question, because I often actually sort of was told that was the worst place to investigate colonial parallels or similarities. The reason being is parts of the Vaterland were Prussia. parts of Danzig, West Prussia. Danzig, for example, were parts of the Kaiserreich, so the German Empire, before the end of the First World War. So to an extent, those territories could have really been perceived as being German. And so, to an extent, how can you colonize a territory that already once belonged to that state? But I sort of step back a little bit from those arguments, and I picked these regions for two main reasons. One of them is because parts of them were German, and that actually allowed me to see quite a few overlaps with the discourse that happened surrounding the former German colonies in Africa. Mm-hmm. And so it's this idea that it's basically almost like this weaponization of history, of German involvement in the territory, that Germans had once settled this area before, that we had in some way invested in the culture here, that we had brought quote unquote civilization with us, that there was this sort of German effort to create this territory once before, and now unfortunately it had been lost due to the circumstances of the World War I. And so now we have to return and re-strengthen this and bring this back. And that's a really interesting sort of parallel between these Eastern European territories and the former overseas African colonies. And also, of course, when these territories are lost, there's population groups, minority population groups that are created. So there's groups of Germans who are now, in inverted commas, sort of stranded under Polish government, under a Polish government. And also the same thing happens, interestingly, in these former overseas colonies in Africa as well. So there's this discourse that, Germans have to rescue these other Germans who are now living under this foreign occupation. And so that's sort of one sort of, I guess, the sort of historical reason. The second reason is that in the Reichsgaue Wartheland and Danzig, West Prussia, they're the two areas that are really from the start of the war, they are marked for Germanization. So they're territories that should become completely German ultimately. And because of this goal, this fantasy, they're the areas that see this really high level of settlement during the war, German settlement, and also a very high level of population Germanization. So this idea of trying to assimilate certain elements. And then sort of leading on from that, the sort of third reason to look at this area, especially in relation to the Wartheland, was actually the first extermination camp is founded in the Wartheland. So although we can't really say that that's the beginning of the Holocaust, it is a step towards this industrial style killing that we're very familiar with.
So you referred to the German experience of colonization and the way it's remembered. I wonder if you could just flesh that out a bit. For those listeners who may not be German specialists, how extensive was German colonization? And how did Germans remember that and respond to it in the years after World War I?
So a common discourse around German overseas colonialism is that they're this sort of imperial latecomer. It's not a very big overseas empire. Generally, if we look at the level of settlement, it's nothing like, for example, the British Empire or the French Empire. And so for a long time, actually, this sort of German colonialism, German colonial history was disregarded, and that's especially in the wake of the Second World War, where the tragedy that was wrought upon Europe by the National Socialists really sort of takes first place in the sort of the research. But now there's sort of this new movement to look at German colonialism a lot more in depth. So that not only looking at the colonies in Africa, but actually what is brought back to the metropole. And so how are German people who maybe never actually get to go see the colonies, never meet a German settler who's been there, how are they perceiving Germany's place in this sort of colonial and imperial game? And what's really interesting is it filters into many different levels of society. So you have different For example, publications are talking about it. There's different newspapers, different magazines. It's taught in schools, of course. The Germans who will later become the adults of the Third Reich are taught all about German colonialism. Our place in the sun is this sort of very famous phrase. They're taught about Germany. They're taught to think about this German Kaiserreich or empire as a player on this imperial stage. They even have things like, for example, different games. There's also this movement towards looking at the American West as well, cowboys and Indians. These sort of things that we see also in other empires. They're all imported back to Germany, and that really informs how they perceive themselves, essentially. What happens after the First World War is it's not only that they sort of lose these colonies in Africa, and it's not only this sort of blow to their global status as an imperial power, but we also have to understand it as the possession of overseas colonies is also, in a way, a signifier of the country as a European country and a European civilization, and that means that there is a right there to colonize and to spread this European civilization. And so with the loss of the colonies, there is this sort of existential crisis of, oh, if we are this European country, we're Europeans, we have this civilization, but we're not entitled to spread this civilization. What is actually our place within Europe? And there's actually, it's a book by Sean Andrew Vempa, and he talks about this, like this loss of not only this part of what's been sort of built into German culture, but it's also this like loss of European identity. That's, of course, just looking more so at Africa and the overseas colonies, but a similar thing actually happens in the East and these parts of Poland. They have this real feeling that they've invested in these areas, that they had made these areas German, and now they're suddenly cut off from them. And so not only in sort of these practical terms of Germans being stranded under foreign occupation, but also in this sort of almost imaginative terms that what we thought was possible there is now no longer possible. And I think this really ties into the sort of politics, but also the sort of societal, I guess, imagination and sort of self-perception as well.
A practical question, matter of definitions before we move forward. You use the terms in the book, ethnic Germans and Reich Germans. For those people who are not familiar with those terms, how are you, what do you mean by these terms, and why do you distinguish between them?
So Reich Germans, I'll start with Reich Germans. German word being Reichsdeutsche. So they are people who are born within the borders of Germany pre-1939. So that's basically known as the Altreich or the Old Reich. So they're born within these German borders. And during the Second World War, after Nazi Germany begins expanding, many Reich Germans start moving to the east, and it's either on a temporary basis, sometimes it's on a permanent basis, and they basically take up different roles in the east. For example, the men, a large majority of the younger men are, of course, soldiers, but there's also older men who work as administrators, teachers, doctors. For the women, they also take on very important roles as teachers, as nurses, as so-called settlement advisors. But also there's Reich German people who are just going to the east in the hope of sort of adventure, and they work your classic jobs in cinemas, in shops, typists. It's really interesting actually to look through some of the newspapers at that time, because you can see who's hiring, who's looking for who, and it actually, looking through them, it just gives the perception of these places as being normal German cities functioning, Adolf Hitler Straße, Adolf Hitler Street. But of course, these places are located in the Reichsgaue, so they are in this Polish territory. So they're the Reich Germans. And ethnic Germans, that's actually a really interesting category. because it can be a little bit vague. So the German word is Volksdeutsche, and I mean it's very hard to get a really proper translation for this Volk. But essentially, what the English term we use is ethnic Germans, and so they are the Germans who are coming from outside of the borders of this Altreich or pre-1939 Germany. So they're generally these minority groups who I talked about who are kind of stranded in areas of Eastern Europe. So some of them would have been descended from German settlements that had been going on in certain areas for thousands of years. So that's places like the Baltics, Latvia, for example, in areas of present-day Ukraine, Romania, but also in Poland. And so some of these groups would have spoken German. They would have sort of presented themselves as German every day. But of course, if some of them were more so descendants from earlier German settlers, they didn't necessarily speak German. They probably identified more so with the sort of local populations. So it's a very diverse group, although the concept is kind of a bit confusing in a way. So basically, whenever it comes up, you sort of have to kind of think of it as having different meanings and potentially also meaning different language abilities. But it's applied in this way, I guess, to try and give a sense of unity in the group. Maybe we can talk about this a bit later, but as I said, there's this idea that we have to save these Germans, and in a way, this term ethnic Germans is used as like a sort of catch-all term for these people who are abroad.
So the first section, as you laid out at the beginning, the first section, couple chapters of this book are about the politics and policies of inclusion. So maybe the place to start about it is to say why did you started to talk about why the German government believed it was important to shift populations of ethnic Germans around. So maybe that, but also especially, how did they try and do it? I mean, what does this policy of inclusion look like on the ground?
So they try and do it in a few different ways. So the idea is that with these ethnic Germans, they're initially living in these parts of Eastern Europe. The war begins, and the question is, how do we bring them back home to the Reich? Is basically the term that they're using for this. And what they do is they do this through a few different steps. They actually send out different groups of so-called, I guess, racial experts to these areas to see who is racially and politically valuable out of these groups of ethnic Germans. And those who are approved are sent to the Reichsgaue even, where they'll ultimately be initially they're sent to these sort of the word is sort of these like transitory camps, and they're observed to make sure that they don't have any health problems, to make sure that there's no signs of sort of political disloyalty, and then they are assigned to usually farms within the Reichsgau Vaterland and Danzig, West Prussia, and while they're assigned farms, I mean, I think a lot of them sort of join this. I think many ethnic Germans actually kind of buy into this fantasy of, oh, we'll be sent back to the Reich, that will get these farms, that will live this life under the German government. In reality, they're not just sort of left alone to tend to the farms by themselves. There is a big sort of state and political involvement. So that involves things like teaching them German, making sure that their children go to German schools. There's a lot of I mean, I would say maybe help in inverted commas, but assistance in kind of modern farming techniques, German farming techniques. There's also assistance in terms of raising children, the healthcare, babies, even right down to how clean their houses are. Attending cultural events, actually attending Christmas events, attending the cinema. And it's all part of essentially integrating these ethnic Germans who, as I said, they could be actually quite diverse, maybe not speak much German or any German at all. And the whole idea is to integrate them into this new German society that's forming in the Reichsgaue. So it is this assimilation process, essentially, that, yeah, I mean, let's say it has mixed results.
I wondered, I was going to ask, how did the ethnic Germans, we'll just use that word, are they happy about this? Are they excited? Is it dependent? I don't even know what the right word is. My assumption is that of the people who are being moved, the more better, the more German they know and the more comfortable they feel in a German culture, presumably the easier this transition is. That's a guess. That's kind of a broad question, but you talk about a lot in the book. How can you summarize it in a...
Yeah, so it's interesting because so the whole sort of resettlement procedure is actually voluntary. So when these ethnic Germans, for example, let's say you're a Baltic German and you're living somewhere in Latvia, it's voluntary for you to sign up for resettlement. But what often happens is your whole sort of community are signing up, or perhaps your family are signing up, because you think that, you know, there's a war going on. So you think that you might be actually safer. You know, maybe some also had certain political leanings. Of course, you have to mention that, but it's initially voluntary. Many of them actually really struggle with the whole resettlement procedure. They're brought to these camps first. Initially, the plan is that they should only be in these camps for a few weeks. Often it happens that they're there for months while they're waiting for more permanent accommodation. I've read sort of letters actually from ethnic German resettlers, as they're called, where they're complaining about the conditions in the camp, that they have to sleep on straw on the ground, that it's very damp, etc. So it's not ideal conditions. And then even when they actually get to their sort of more permanent accommodation or their houses or their farms, they're still sort of faced with I guess trying to fit into this new National Socialist societal hierarchy. And not all of them are happy about this. I mean, I've read different reports of certain groups really struggling, for example, with the German language. Sometimes they're sort of perceived by the Reich Germans as being lazy, as sort of not really being interested in joining in this kind of national effort. And so it's interesting because I think on a sort of macro level, you look at this settlement, and thousands of these ethnic German resettlers actually come to the Reichsgaue, and you see that they do Germanize towns, they change the Polish names to German, they set up schools, but then on these micro levels, when you read the reports, when you read the letters, there are problems coming up, and sometimes, interestingly as well, Nazi Germany's expansion creates sometimes problems, because for these early resettlers, they come to Poland, they start their farms, but the Nazi German territory just keeps expanding. And so in some cases, Nazi Germany actually claims territory that these ethnic Germans originally lived in. And so they sort of start saying, well, can I not actually just go back home again? And so there's actually numerous problems within the whole system, but you kind of have to look beyond this sort of facade and this propaganda and this fantasy about how great it's all going and how great it's all working.
I'm thinking in my head, and I will just ask this, knowing that it may not be an appropriate way to think about this, but a lot of the description you just gave sounds very much like the process of immigration into the United States in the 19th century, that you can think of these people as immigrants who need to be taught and assimilated and cultured. I don't know if that's the right word. Is that even a reasonable lens to look at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so that these ethnic Germans, they occupy such an interesting place because in theory, racially they are counted under this Nazi system as being German. Yet on the other hand, they still have to be Germanized, and also they are settlers, and that they're settling this Polish territory. Yet they still haven't reached this sort of societal level of being sort of trusted to do it. So it's a real mixture of different, I guess, narratives and different understandings of who these people are. I think, I mean, I know that it's interesting because there are sort of I mean, maybe it's sort of a challenge to this idea of their assimilation being similar to colonial assimilation is sometimes like, oh well, they look like Germans, some of them speak like Germans. Can it be sort of colonialism of Germans, or is that sort of a nationalization process? But what's interesting is I've read actually a bit on nationalization, and that's also sometimes conceived of in also kind of colonial terms. So this idea that there's this kind of this standard that has to be met, and that these new population groups have to meet it. And interestingly, actually talking about the ethnic Germans as settlers within different colonies, there are different hierarchies of European settlers. So not all European settlers are treated the same. For example, Irish settlers in Australia were sort of seen as the lower level of settler in comparison to British. And oftentimes, for example, it happened in the German colonies in Africa, the settlers themselves are also screened. So we still see these parallels kind of working in a way that almost in order to be allowed to give a license, so almost like to be, to have this license to sort of exist in society as a free person, as a person who brings this civilization, you really have to be evaluated yourself.
And so maybe as a way to kind of summarize this part of the book, you hinted at it just a minute ago. As I read the book, you suggest that the attempt to demographically restructure Poland kind of rhymes with colonization, but not with the Poles, but with the relationship between Reich Germans and ethnic Germans. Can you say a little bit more about that assessment?
Yeah, so as I was sort of saying there, if we sort of break down what happens in these Germanization processes, a lot of it, it's not only this movement onto the territory, but it's also these sort of practical everyday things, like, for example, teaching ethnic German mothers how to look after their children, sending the children to German schools, bringing in these sort of modern farming methods. And all of these elements have parallels in colonial assimilation processes. And of course, it's sometimes very easy to talk about colonialism in these kind of general terms, but there are always specifics. So different colonies, different European colonies did function in different ways. But there are patterns. So these sort of patterns of this idea of bringing education or hygiene to these populations, this sort of along the lines of this civilizing mission is very prominent throughout European history. But also looking at it from the sort of perspective of the Reich Germans and this sort of National Socialist apparatus, I wanted to look at to see how are they selling this to themselves almost? How are they understanding what they're doing in the Reichsgaue, and how are they understanding their interactions with the ethnic Germans? And what comes through is, for many people, of course, you're not always 100% sure how truthful they are, but at least you can identify these sort of tropes or these sort of discourses of, we're really helping these people. We're bringing German culture to these areas. We're teaching German, like especially a lot of the sort of material we have come from females who are sent to Poland, and they're talking about the joy that they get in their work from teaching the ethnic German children, and they really have this sense that they're taking on a task, and it's for Germany, it's for the nation, and they're really helping these ethnic Germans to sort of fit in. And we see that also in colonial models too. This kind of, I guess a little bit along the lines of sort of white man's burden, that you sort of take up this yoke of civilization, and it's a duty to spread this Western civilization to different parts. And even in terms of how some Reich Germans talk about the ethnic Germans, they often use terms like they're primitive, they didn't have any soap before we met them. There's situations of different interactions where Reich Germans are really perceiving themselves as like a very sort of I guess the sort of patriarchal sort of sense that we know what we're talking about, and I think there's even a case of a Reich German. I think she was a nurse or a teacher, kind of calling the ethnic Germans like her problem children. So also a sort of infantilization, and these sort of discourses or these narratives are very similar to how certain settlers or colonial powers are also understanding their roles in colonies. And so, although I see this a lot between the Reich Germans and the ethnic Germans, the Poles are a bit more complicated, because it's the case that some Poles are deported, or they're essentially excluded from society, whereas other Poles who sort of fit in with the sort of Nazi racial criteria, they are also occasionally Germanized. And so that's interesting, because they then go through this same sort of assimilation process then. But because it's a bit of a different case, it's a bit harder than to sort of say that this lines directly. Whereas I think the ethnic Germans and the Reich Germans are just this interesting case, and a strange sort of mix between, colonized and colonizer.
Well, let's turn then to that next section of the book, which is about exclusionary policies. And so, to start with, what do you mean when you talk about the exclusionary elements of German population policies? And then how does this, and you started to talk about this a second ago, how did these exclusionary policies intersect with the goals and visions of the inclusionary policies?
So I guess these exclusionary elements of these policies, they're more or less working towards excluding different population groups. And initially, we can see it beginning with physical exclusions, such as mass deportations of Poles and Jews. That's really at the start of the war. That happens in the two Reichsgaue. But also once Germany annexed these Reichsgaue, they bring in a set of different legal rules that also limit what Polish people can do. For example, rules about public transport, rules about cinemas, rules about schools. And then in the sort of later stages, what we see is less of a focus on deporting Poles and more of this focus on the Polish Jewish population. And that comes along with this creation of ghettos. Basically kicking Jewish people out of their homes, their apartments, and placing them in ghettos, usually stealing their valuables, just completely taking over everything that they owned. And so that's also the sort of I would say initial levels of excluding, and then that's not to forget the violence that also happens. And I also place these within exclusionary policies, which is initially directed against Poles. For example, at the start of the war, there is this what's known as the intelligentsia action, so that the Germans initially begin by murdering members of the Polish intelligentsia, and then they ultimately begin murdering members of the Jewish population. And that's what I was talking about this first extermination camp opening in Helmno in the Vaterland. And so that's the sort of the ultimate exclusion, essentially, is this mass murder. In terms of how the sort of inclusionary measures and the exclusionary measures interact with one another, there's sort of a few different levels that we can look at. One is, of course, that the sort of racial apparatus in place, it's more or less the same, this sort of screening. So what the racial sort of criteria that is applied to one person, and then they meet this criteria, and that allows them to be included into society. That's the same sort of apparatus or criteria that is applied to another person who maybe is then told they do not meet actually this this criteria, and they are then marked for exclusion. So this sort of boundary between inclusion and exclusion is the same in this case. Another interaction between the two is these mass deportations of Poles and Jews that happens at the start of the war, and then the later deportation of Jews and their ghettoization has a direct impact on the settlement of the ethnic Germans, because, of course, by expelling Polish and Jewish people from their homes and from their farms, they're actually making room for these incoming ethnic German settlers. And what's actually very disturbing is sometimes this is happening within a few hours. So there's Polish people being thrown out of their houses. Usually female Reich Germans come in and give the house a clean. Sometimes they might cook a meal or something. And then the ethnic German resettlers arrive in this new home, and there's actually stories of, sometimes they come in and it's still actually chaos in the house. You can tell that someone's had to leave in a rush. There's stories of one person who said the bed was still warm, actually. So it's this direct replacement. They're literally throwing people out on one hand and then moving people in. Another thing is with this sort of property replacement, there's also this economic replacement, because what happens is the ethnic Germans take over these farms and they start farming the land. But there's also, other jobs like shops, businesses, where ethnic Germans come in and take them over. And it's as if the Polish population had never existed there. Where I see a particularly tragic instance of this replacement is Jews who were murdered in Helmno. Their clothing and belongings were collected, and it was the case, I found it in different reports, that this clothing was then cleaned, repaired, and then redistributed to ethnic Germans. So in this case, even the ethnic Germans are actually getting the clothes of the Jews who were murdered. The last sort of point about how the two interact is, of course, exclusion was seen as a means to protect the sort of status quo that the inclusion was creating. So by including these people into the Reich, into German society, the National Socialists are trying to create this new German society. They're trying to Germanize this territory. They're trying to really make it German. And to protect that, they have to exclude these undesirable elements. So the two are always sort of, even though it's very different methods, they're always working in tandem with one another.
When it was in publication, I used to assign my students this wonderful short novel by Ferdinand Oyonnax called Houseboy, about colonization in the Cameroon, and about the way those indigenous peoples who had been colonized were able to maneuver around the colonizers by using indigenous languages and by taking advantages of the stereotypes that colonizers had. And I wonder, for those ethnic Germans who were being resettled, did they take advantage of the fact that they might speak a little bit of Polish or might know the landscape a little bit better? Do they retreat to that language when they need to have conversations they don't want these Reichsgermans to hear? I just wonder if that dynamic plays out here.
Yeah, language certainly does play into it because, of course, in the case of the ethnic Germans who were in Poland before this German invasion, they would have spoken Polish. And often they had Polish friends or family. And there are cases of in Reich German reports essentially trying to, more or less dissuade them from being Polish. So I haven't seen any cases of them sort of specifically maybe sort of giving secret messages or anything like that. But there is sort of this, there's this overlap certainly, and there are cases of people who, so they're let's say officially counted as German, but they will openly say that they're Polish and they don't want to be counted as German. And what's interesting in the Vaterland, for example, is they don't ban the Polish language. So even though German becomes the main language of the administration, of the schools, Polish is still kept to an extent. And it's also sort of, in a way, it's used as a boundary, as a marker. So there's a specific effort to not teach the Poles too much German, because you want that signifier, a signifier that you can hear, because you might not necessarily be able to see the difference between a German and a Pole, that you can tell in the way that the Polish person speaks German that they are not a German. But there is actually a recommendation as well from some members of the German administration that Germans should learn Polish so that they can understand in case anyone's saying anything about them. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that then language actually becomes a marker of difference between them.
Interesting. So we're getting toward the end of our time, so let's pull back then. So if you kind of had to summarize the return back to the big ideas of the book, how can we best understand the way colonization shaped or influenced or impacted the German attempts to engineer the biopolitics of this region?
So it's a big question, even though we've been talking about this. But
You're welcome.
I guess on one hand, it's we can look at the sort of prior history of the territory, that they have this previous involvement of settlement, of culture there. And that kind of informs the perception of the territory, how the people are thinking about it, how they perceive their role there. Myself and Frank Bayer have written a little bit about this as well, that colonialism as a very general sort of concept provides a kind of frame of meaning. So it's sort of like a familiar vocabulary or rhetoric or discourse that's, it's not necessarily a conscious thing, but they're aligning themselves to what we can see in other patterns. And I know some historians have argued as to whether perhaps there's this sort of like a colonial archive, almost this imaginary archive that actors or that they draw from. But other historians have argued that that's a bit too conscious, too purposeful, and we should see it actually more as this imperial cloud. So that that's two historians, Jonas Kayenbaum and Christoph Kamenzech, they talk about this idea of a cloud, like a server, a digital cloud, and it's this sort of flexible transnational knowledge transfer that's not necessarily always traceable. And I think in a way that's a good way to sort of think of what's happening here in the Reichsgaue, the two Reichsgaue, that although certain German actors aren't necessarily understanding what they do as colonialism, it's still kind of coming from this sort of general kind of thought process. And actually sometimes they make a distinct effort to differentiate themselves from colonialism. So they purposely say, don't call these areas in Poland colonies, because they have an association of colonies with Africa. So they're purposely putting in a differentiation there. But just because they're differentiating doesn't mean that what the rest of what they're doing kind of aligns with these patterns. I think talking about how colonialism shapes or influences, I guess I'm hesitant to sort of try and draw any kind of strict continuity between colonialism and then the expansion into the East and the Holocaust. So while I think that this prehistory is very important, this sort of frame of meaning, frame of reference, I think it is often easier to look at things through these patterns and talking about how inclusion and exclusion interlink. For me, it does fit very much into these models. So whether we can say it shaped it really, or just that it's similar to, or it fits into patterns. Settler colonialism is the big one that I pick up on in the book. Settler colonialism essentially is geared towards removal. And so I think what we see in the inclusionary and in the exclusionary policies in the two Reichsgaue is really this aim of removal. The National Socialists want to create a homogenous territory. And so they will remove through many different methods, all differences, cultural, political, ethnic differences that they find. And so while we can sort of see these very flexible, shaping, influencing links, I think ultimately when it does come to something like the Holocaust, it's probably better to talk about it more so in terms of aligning with different patterns.
And you talked earlier about the importance of thinking about new questions. So if historians of mass violence, genocide, read your book, what kind of new questions would you hope they would get from it that they could take to other incidences of mass violence?
I think, so on one hand, I sort of think, yeah, it's hard because on one hand, I don't always think it's a good idea that we have this idea of the Holocaust as this benchmark for genocide, because I do think it detracts from others. But on the other hand, it's something that does happen. And so to maybe lean into that a little bit, because here, what I talk about in my book, my research talks about the Holocaust, which is undoubtedly a genocide, and that we place this event of mass violence and mass murder into this. I guess, put it back into this sort of story of expansion and territorial control and population policy, and sort of, I guess, reintegrate it into the whole National Socialist setup. I do hope that historians who are looking at mass violence or even colonial violence can perhaps do the same. So to look at how sometimes maybe we shouldn't just be looking at violence to actually understand these violent acts, if that makes sense. So in this case, to look at the Holocaust, I also looked at settlement, and I also looked at assimilation, and I looked at school policies and things like this, to see where all these little different pieces fit together and form this overall picture of what I see as this aim to remove, to homogenize. And so I do hope that perhaps in other disciplines, they can also look at something like this. And also, if we break it down again to looking at education and memory, that, colonial violence, even though it maybe doesn't count under a sort of present day definition of genocide, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was any less destructive, or that it had any less of an impact on the victims and the descendants and the sort of society as it exists today.
Yeah, we didn't get a chance, and your book doesn't necessarily specific touch on that, but we didn't get a chance to talk about how some of these ethnic Germans 10 or 15 or 20 years on would remember this experience and would accept or reject this label of the particular identity. But that's for a separate conversation. So now I'd just like to kind of raise the same two questions that I ask everybody at the end of interviews. So the first one is, it is my fall break. or it will be after you and I finish discussing. And instead of grading, I would really like to do something that is, I should not say in public, less interesting, but we'll all admit it. So what book or exhibit or movie, something, what would you suggest to the audience and me that that we should go read, look at, watch, that something that resonates with the theme of this book and mattered to you?
Yeah, so I recently have, I guess it's like a blog post on the online, it's like an online blog or magazine, Copernico, it's called, Copernico. And they have a recent thematic focus on Eastern European post-colonial, and this has been essentially loads of different contributions. Not too hard on the take. It won't take up too much reading time, let's say. And what's really nice about the website is they highlight a lot of the keywords and they link and they explain everything. So I think it's actually, if someone is interested in sort of post-colonial perspectives on Eastern European history, it would be a really great starting point, even just to see what sort of discussions are going on at the moment or who is involved in them as well.
Excellent. And then what are you working on now?
So I'm starting a new project on cultural genocide and how it relates to the Holocaust, but also to Germanization. And so I'm looking at annexed Poland on one hand, and also the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, so the part of what was then Czechoslovakia that was also annexed to the Reich. Essentially looking at how culture, that is the sort of attempted destruction of Jewish culture, ran alongside the Holocaust, but also sort of looking again at Germanization, almost coming back to this theme, but what impact that had on culture, and can we fit it into this very rather flexible concept at the moment of cultural genocide, and how that also plays into the ideas of extermination and homogenization.
We've been talking with Rachel O'Sullivan, author of Nazi Germany, Annexed Poland and Colonial Rule, Resettlement, Germanization, and Population Policies in Comparative Perspective. Rachel, that sounds like a great project. And so I hope in the future you'll come back and talk about it again on the podcast. But for now, thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your fall.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, hopefully, I don't know how long I'll be keeping you waiting for the next book, but I'll try to get it done as soon as possible. But thanks again for the great conversation.